on Identity Politics, Ressentiment and the Evacuation of Human Emancipation by Camilla Bassi. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Karl Marx. The late modern liberal subject quite literally seethes with ressentiment. Wendy Brown. Prologue. At the UK-based National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts NCAFC annual conference held at the University of Birmingham Students' Union on the 23rd of November 2013, I spoke on a panel titled Privilege, Intersectionality and Fighting Oppression. In preparation for my talk, I had assumed no prior knowledge on the audience's behalf so as to make my intervention as accessible as possible. My basic introduction of Marxism therein was to illustrate both its intersectionality and its distinct perspective on exploitation and resistance. One of the other panel speakers stated during the discussion that I had made an assumption that everyone in the room was at the same level, and that the use of high convoluted language by people who are able to read theory is a privilege and is therefore oppressive and exclusionary. She frustrated in such discussions about privilege and intersectionality, people in general refused to shut up about Marx. She pushed an anti-intellectualism and an anti-Marxism which troubled me, since there was no reflection on such questions, simply indictments. Moreover, she appeared to be angry with me, and that puzzled me, because I had kept my contribution respectful of other positions. I wondered then, how emotionally healthy and politically useful is an anger that forestalls open thought and exchange? On the 1st of May 2014, International Workers' Day, I attended a session titled Intersectionality Checking Our Own Privilege at the launch event of the Free University of Sheffield. The African-American woman leading the session problematised an image used by the white organisers to advertise the event, an image that she described as black African children holding a free education poster. This was, she said, an ignorant appropriation. The white audience sat in an awkward moment of silence, looking concerned by their accidental but privileged appropriation of an image of the unprivileged. I, a British Indian, was one of the two non-white participants in the room. The other, of course, was the session leader. I spoke up. While we must be sensitive to the temporal and spatial specificities and therein the lived experiences of such images, there is also something universal here. The session leader replied with incredulity, "What could you possibly think you had in common with the people in this image?" I suggested the universal struggle for free education, and also perhaps the universal struggle for free healthcare, and the universal struggle for independent trade unions. There was no reply, just another moment of awkward silence. At the end of the session, I left with the impression of a politics where no one can speak for anyone else, resulting in a navel-gazing entanglement. The academic repression I proceed to discuss in this chapter is that by a neoliberal wave of identity politics in the form of intersectionality and privilege theory. It is a repression of self by self, which precludes connection, bypasses freedom and generates ressentiment. I explore a specific case study of the political deadlock between a current of radical feminists and a current of transgender and transsexual activists, both with wider sympathisers, which has played out on social media and across university campuses. I offer a general theoretical and practical call for dialogue between left-wing academics and students in the hope that we can, once again, collectively aspire for freedom. Where did freedom go? In States of Injury, the political scientist Wendy Brown observes that in the era of late modernity, as the bleak reality of a contorted Marxism is framed against the sunshine of liberalism, progressives have chosen to pursue a form of freedom which is based on state-managed economic justice and private liberties. Furthermore, freedom has shown itself to be easily appropriated in liberal regimes for the most cynical and unemancipatory political ends, such that Brown continues, the dream of democracy, that freedoms might govern themselves by governing together, is difficult to discern in the proliferation of claims of rights, protections, regulations and entitlements. Brown does not dispute the importance of rights, protections, regulations and entitlements, but rather she asks, beyond this, what is our dream of freedom? She defends the explanatory power of Marxism in seeing the question of freedom vis-à-vis social relations, which are implicitly declared unpolitical, that is, naturalised in liberal discourse. In other words, genuine freedom cannot be found in state redistribution. Here it is helpful to understand the important distinction Marx makes between political emancipation and human emancipation, which can be found in his essay on the Jewish question that was part of a debate with the left Hegelian Bruno Bauer. Marx's discussion is not per se a consideration of the Jewish condition, but a critique of political emancipation in order to expose the relationship of political emancipation to human emancipation. Marx acknowledges the great, real, practical progress of political emancipation, that is, liberal rights and liberties. However, on its limits, he argues that whilst the capitalist state abolishes in its own way the distinctions of class, birth, profession and education, by declaring them to be unpolitical differences, it allows them to have an effect in their own manner. What is inherent in political emancipation, Marx spells out, is a gap between human beings as ideally public members of a universal state or citizens and materially private egotistic members of civil society or bourgeois. As such, humankind leads a twofold existence, a heavenly one and an earthly one. Private rights are innately bourgeois and the basis of the separation of human beings from one another. Marx states, man was not freed from religion. He received freedom of religion. He was not freed from property. He received freedom of property. He was not freed from the egotism of trade. He received freedom to trade. Marx deplored the debasement of theory, art, history, nature and human relations by religion, property, commodities and commerce. He deplores the bartering of women, which he describes the species relationship itself as an object of commerce. This debasement, he contends, is the exile of human beings' communal essence. Marx foresees human liberation as the eradication of the aforementioned gap. In other words, the freedom of human beings is contingent not merely on political emancipation, but on human emancipation, which necessitates the abolition of capitalist social relations. Returning to Brown's states of injury, she astutely remarks that the right's ability to capture a discourse of freedom for its own ends, alongside the tendency of progressive politics to abandon the socialist project on the basis of its supposed failure, apropos Stalinism, has led in academia to, she says, developments in philosophy, in feminist, post-colonial and cultural theory that have eroded freedom's ground. For many toiling in these domains, freedom has been swept onto the dust heap of anachronistic, humanistic, androcentric, subject-centric and Western shibboleths. So while Marxism desires human emancipation from capitalism, Brown asks, to what extent do identity politics require a standard internal to existing society against which to pitch their claims, a standard that not only preserves capitalism from critique, but sustains the invisibility and inarticulatedness of class, not accidentally but endemically? Could we have stumbled upon one reason why class is invariably named but rarely theorised or developed in the multiculturalist mantra, race, class, gender, sexuality? Bringing forward Brown's argument, it is worth considering the context for the present-day popularity of privilege theory and intersectionality. Identity politics and self-subjugation. Privilege theorist pioneer Peggy McIntosh states, "What I believe is that everybody has a combination of unearned advantage and unearned disadvantage in life. We are all put ahead and behind by the circumstances of our birth. In order to understand the way privilege works, you have to be able to see patterns and systems in social life, but you also have to care about individual experiences. I think one's own individual experience is sacred. Testifying to it is very important." The basic premise of privilege theory is that wherever there is an oppressive structure, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity and so on, there is both an oppressed group of people and a privileged group of people who consciously or not benefit from that structure. Interlaced with privilege theory is the notion of intersectionality, that we are all privileged by some structures of oppression and burdened by other structures of oppression. Thus our privileges and our oppressions intersect. At a macro level, race, gender and class, for example, are seen as distinct yet interlocking structures of oppression, whereas the notion of intersectionality describes micro-level processes, namely how each individual and group occupies a social position within interlocking structures of oppression. Moreover, in a matrix of domination, each individual derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege from the multiple systems of oppression which frame everyone's lives. By lacking full awareness of our privileges and their intersectionality, the reasoning goes, we are politically divided and weak, and whilst we cannot be held responsible for the structures of oppression that impart privilege upon us, we do have a choice in how we respond to our privilege. For instance, to our whiteness, our maleness, our straightness, our ableness, our cisness, etc. The origins of privilege theory and intersectionality can be traced to the theoretical framework of identity politics in the 1980s and the 1990s, which developed amid labour movement defeats and the expansion of the neoliberal project of free market capitalism, including free trade, deregulation, privatisation and austerity during the Thatcher and Reagan years. In Britain specifically, the government policy of multiculturalism in the 1980s and 90s, popular with leftist local councils, furthered the notion of discrete ethnic identities from which gains could be made by state accommodation. And from 1998, marketisation began in the higher education sector with the introduction of tuition fees. By the late 1980s and 1990s, second-wave feminism had given way to third-wave feminism, whose theory was very much influenced by academic postmodernism and identity politics. Third-wave feminists Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins developed the concept of intersectionality in the early 1990s. Both also drew on earlier second-wave feminist discussions by black feminists in the United States. In 1997, the Boston-based black lesbian feminist Combahee River Collective advanced the concept of simultaneity and stressed the importance of personal identity. I quote, "We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics comes directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression." The elephant in the room vis-a-vis the identity politics of intersectionality and privilege theory is Marxism. Collins dismisses the radical, i.e. Marxist left, as saying, I quote, "If only people of colour and women could see their true class interest, class solidarity would eliminate racism and sexism." There can be no denying an element of truth to this claim. What's more, dominant sections of the revolutionary Marxist left have a damning record of pandering to racism, sexism and homophobia for organisational gain. But abandoning altogether the explanatory power of Marxism leaves us short on the question of how to achieve social change. Intersectionality applies a generalised cultural and economic understanding of class alongside other registers of oppression such as gender and sexuality. I question what might be lost in its implicit redefinition of class, qua classism when thinking through the nature of oppression and exploitation and the means of resistance. Class, after all, is not primarily a structure of oppression, but a systematic relation of exploitation. Given also that racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia, for instance, are individually distinct forms of oppression with individually distinct relationships to capitalism, which include specific and universal features, the danger with intersectionality lies in it sliding into a conceptual collapse through its kaleidoscopic intersecting structures of oppression, and in it nullifying universality whilst in pursuit of specificity. In privilege theory, people tend to talk about white supremacy rather than racism, but the former carries no explanatory power over the latter. White supremacy falls short in being able to analyse and politically respond to anti-Irish racism, anti-Gypsy racism and anti-Semitism, for example. And the emphasis on personal testimony, remember as McIntosh states, one's individual experience is sacred, overrides the possibility for any universal truths. The net effect is no way out vis-a-vis resistance. Marx makes plain on the Jewish question that the route to real freedom lies in social relations, not rights alone. Brown's astute point on the lack of theorising of class in the multiculturalist mantra resonates especially well in the present-day privilege theory and intersectionality mantra. Is it not time to name and call out once more what is, in reality, the relinquishment of the dream of freedom, as humans governing themselves by governing together? Present-day identity politics is based on an unchanging status. As the privilege theorist Kimmel asserts, one can no more renounce privilege than one can stop breathing. Rather than a dynamic understanding of human consciousness through human history, society is viewed as a seesaw. You're up there because I'm down here, and you're up there because you weigh me down. It is a personalised dual-camp distortion of social relations, me versus you, with various intersectional combinations that breeds resentment and is devoid of class politics. Ultimately, freedom has become dangerously lost in the contradiction of identity politics, as Brown observes. Politicised identities generated out of liberal disciplinary societies, insofar as they are premised on exclusion from a universal ideal, require that ideal, as well as their exclusion from it, for their own continuing existence as identities. She develops Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment to explain how the desired impulse of politicised identity to inscribe in the law and other political registers its historical and present pain forecloses an imagined future of power to make itself. What one has instead of freedom then is the production of ressentiment, which she explains. Ressentiment in this context is a triple achievement. It produces an affect, rage, righteousness that overwhelms the hurt. It produces a culprit responsible for the hurt, and it produces a site of revenge to displace the hurt, a place to inflict hurt as the sufferer has been hurt. We are left with an effort to anaesthetise and to externalise what is unendurable. I turn now to this chapter's case study, a toxic war between a current of radical feminists and a current of trans activists, both of which with wider layers of sympathisers. This is a war that has played out on social media and across university campuses, and which has impeded connection, circumvented freedom, and bred ressentiment. Privilege production of impasse, the case of the deadlock between radical feminists and trans activists. In February 2015, a letter titled "We Cannot Allow Censorship and Silencing of Individuals" was published in The Observer, signed by several academics and feminist and LGBT activists. It identifies a worrying pattern of intimidation and silencing of individuals whose views are deemed transphobic or whorephobic. Most of the people so labelled are feminists or pro-feminist men. Some have experience in the sex industry, some are transgender. No platforming used to be a tactic used against self-proclaimed fascists and Holocaust deniers, but today it is being used to prevent the expression of feminist arguments critical of the sex industry and of some demands made by trans activists. The feminists who hold these views have never advocated or engaged in violence against any group of people. Yet it is argued that the mere presence of anyone said to hold these views is a threat to a protected minority group's safety. You do not have to agree with the views that are being silenced to find these tactics illiberal and undemocratic. Universities have a particular responsibility to resist this kind of bullying. As important background to this letter, two high-profile public confrontations are worth noting. The first relates to the radical feminist Julie Bindel. In 2012, the National Union of Students LGBTQ campaign passed a motion of no platform against Bindel for her alleged transphobia. Bindel had made offensive comments in relation to transsexual people in a 2004 piece for The Guardian, which she later apologised for as misplaced and insensitive. The NUS motion included the sentence, "Conference believes that Julie Bindel is vile." The history of NUS's no platform policy relates specifically to fascism, and debate on no platform has tended to centre on the question, while fascists, given the direct physical threat they pose, must be no platformed, should one, and indeed can one, no platform racists? In this context, the no platforming of Julie Bindel is extraordinary, as she joined a list that includes Elmer Jeroen, the British National Party, the English Defence League and Hizb ut-Tahrir, fascistic political forces that incite violence. In autumn 2014, Bindel was due to speak at the University of Sheffield Students' Union on her book Straight Expectations, but a week before she was due, the student management banned her. A year later, in autumn 2015, Bindel was invited by the Free Speech and Secular Society at the University of Manchester Students' Union to partake in a debate titled "From Liberation to Censorship, Does Modern Feminism Have a Problem with Free Speech?" Once again, she was banned by the student management. The Student Union Women's Officer stated in defence of the decision that this is not about shutting down conversations or denying free speech, this is about keeping our students safe. The second high-profile public confrontation was the backlash generated from an article titled "Seeing Red" in the New Statesman in 2013, written by the journalist and feminist Suzanne Moore. In the article, Moore argues against austerity, and for those who are hardest hit by austerity, women, to be angry and to resist. She says, "It's not just the double shift of work and domestic duties that women do, there is now a third shift. We must keep ourselves sexually attractive forever. The cliche is that female anger is always turned inwards rather than outwards into despair. We are angry with ourselves for not being happier, not being loved properly, and not having the ideal body shape, that of a Brazilian transsexual. We are angry that men do not do enough. We are angry at work when we are underpaid and overlooked. This anger can be neatly channeled and outsourced to make someone a fat profit. Are your hormones okay? Do you need a nice bath?" A significant reaction followed this publication against Moore's alleged transphobic reference to a Brazilian transsexual, an implicit reference to the model Leah T. This was a vitriolic row between, in the main, radical feminists and trans activists, which played out on social media and in the press, and included Moore herself temporarily resigning from Twitter, apologising for a throwaway comment and stating, "I am not your enemy." Cultural theory academic Sara Ahmed, in retort to the Observer letter, "We cannot allow censorship and silencing of individuals," contends in a blog post titled "You Are Oppressing Us." Politics is rarely about one good and one bad side, nor about innocence on one side and guilt on the other, but politics is also messy because power is asymmetrical. Transphobia and anti-trans statements should not be treated as just another viewpoint that we should be free to express at the happy diversity table. There cannot be a dialogue when some at the table are in effect or intent arguing for the elimination of others at the table. The presentation of trans activists as a lobby and as bullies rather than as minorities who are constantly being called upon to defend their right to exist is a mechanism of power. Sadly, this letter is evidence that the mechanism is working. Racists present themselves as injured, under attack, a minority fighting against a powerful anti-racist lobby that is busy suppressing their voices. We can hear resonance without assuming analogy. Contrary, I think, to Ahmed here, Brown stresses that while we must recognise that social injury such as that conveyed through derogatory speech becomes that which is unacceptable and individually culpable, it actually symptomises deep political distress in a culture. One day after the Observer letter was published, signatory and English classics academic Mary Beard reported, "Last night I went to bed wanting to weep. It was the relentless pummelling of attack on the basis of extraordinary loaded, sometimes quite wrong readings of the letter. The complaints fall into several categories. 1, I am an appalling transphobe. 2, I am a bit past it, a poor old lady who hasn't quite got the issues straight, bless her. 3, I have been duped by the transphobes because I'm a nice person, really. I was not signing up to an attack on the trans community." Another signatory, human rights activist Peter Tatchell, stated, "I've received about 5,000 messages attacking me. The volume and vitriol of the attack has been almost unprecedented in 48 years of human rights campaigning. I'm shocked. I have supported the transgender freedom struggle for 40 years, but I have been accused of trying to silence trans people and called an advocate for oppressors. The letter was about freedom of speech and includes no attack on trans rights. When I signed the letter, I did not know who else was going to sign it. Now I'm being condemned by the McCarthyite tactic of guilt by association." Here we see in action the aforementioned triple feat of ressentiment, the production of an effect, a rage and a righteousness that overwhelms a hurt, a culprit who was responsible for the hurt, and a sight of revenge to displace the hurt, all of which temporarily anaesthetise and externalise the hurt, but demolish any potential for political coalition. The radical feminist transactivist deadlock is the privileged production of impasse, and a symptom of acute political distress in which freedom has been abandoned for ressentiment. On the one hand, we have a camp of people insisting that those born into biologically male bodies carry privilege regardless of their identification as women, privilege over women who have an entire lived experience of being women and of its related oppression. On the other hand, we have a camp of people arguing that there are those who are cisgendered, whose gender aligns with their sex at birth and who carry cis power and privilege, privilege over those who have a lived experience of being transgendered, whose gender doesn't align with their sex at birth and of its related oppression. In a neoliberal wave of identity politics, the politicised identification of personal bodily experiences and the struggle to trump or negate such bodily experiences in a battle over power asymmetry effectively lets power off the hook. Privilege theorist, activist Maya Mackenzie prescribes 4 ways to push back against one's privilege. 1, relinquish power. 2, don't go. She uses as an example women-only events that exclude trans women. 3, shut up. And 4, be careful what identities you claim. Consider, she says, how your privilege gives you access to claim identities even when your lived experience does not support it. The irony of Mackenzie advocating a no turning up protest against a radical feminist exclusion of trans women from women-only spaces is that radical feminists are employing their own argument against claiming identities when lived experience does not correspond. Crucially, Mackenzie's prescription encapsulates how a politics that promises to allow a plethora of voices to be heard is in actuality the opposite. A ressentiment-sieved silencing. I speak, you shut up. You cannot know my pain. Your experience is incomparable to my suffering. The impasse between radical feminists and trans activists is just this, a silencing of either trans activists or of radical feminists, or of a wider layer of sympathisers on either side or both sides, or on neither side. Instructively, in an effort to bring peace to the so-called border wars between butch lesbians and female-to-male transsexuals, gender and queer theorist Halberstam notes that many subjects, not only transsexual subjects, do not feel at home in their bodies, and insists on taking into account the wider neoliberal political economic context, stating, because bodily flexibility has become both a commodity in the case of cosmetic surgeries, for example, and a form of commodification, it is not enough in this age of flexibility to celebrate gender flexibility as simply another sign of progress and liberation. Halberstam remarks, in mainstream gay, lesbian and trans communities in the United States, battles rage about what group occupies the more transgressive or aggrieved position, and only rarely are such debates framed in terms of larger discussions about capitalism, class or economics. Transgressive exceptionalism, a byproduct of local translations of neoliberalism, has become the practice of taking the moral high ground by claiming to be more oppressed and more extraordinary than others. Halberstam's notion of transgressive exceptionalism chimes with the work of Brown on wound culture as a contemporary form of Nietzschean ressentiment, in which, as Cadman puts it, current forms of identity politics become attached to destructive modes of their own subjection. The political challenge we're left with is, how do we support the struggle for political emancipation by and for trans activist movements worldwide, while demanding open space to critically understand and debate the construction of gender, and to forge alliances for future human emancipation. Finding our way back to freedom. The chasm Marx identifies between human beings as, on the one hand, citizens of a universal political community and, on the other hand, private, alienated, egotistic individuals of a civil society, is reflected in the contradiction of a neoliberal wave of identity politics considered and critiqued in this chapter. Halberstam is correct in seeing the identity politics problematic as, in part, a failure of the academy itself, stating the rehearsal of identity-bound debates outside the academy speaks not simply to a lack of sophistication in such debates, but suggests that academics have failed to take their ideas beyond the university and have not made necessary interventions in public intellectual venues. Brown, going further still, recognises academic developments in philosophy and in feminist post-colonial and cultural theory as foreclosing any kind of socialist project for human emancipation on the basis of the failure of Stalinism, which is crudely subsumed into Marxism in general. Our journey back to the dream of freedom requires us as academics making a case for supplanting a politics of I am, which closes down identity and fixes it within a social and moral hierarchy, with a politics of I want this for us. Quoting Brown. If we fail to help make this happen, we will remain locked in a history that has weight but no trajectory, mass but no coherence, force but no direction, thus stagnated, again quoting Brown, in a war without ends or end. I end with 10 tactics for challenging the academic repression of identity politics. 1. To positively engage in the aspects of intersectionality and privilege theory that strengthen and enrich more traditional forms of class politics, for example by taking into account and reflecting upon the specific experiences and intersectionalities of oppressions. 2. To challenge the aspects of intersectionality and privilege theory that effectively fix human identity and detach human identity from evolving material conditions of existence. 3. To expose and explore the elephant in the room of intersectionality and privilege theory, i.e. Marxism, in order to critically assess its insight into the relationship between political emancipation and human emancipation. 4. To call upon academics to engage with the politics on their university campuses and in student activist circles. 5. To organise teach-ins and reading groups between academics and their students on political theory and issues. 6. To forge alliances between labour movement struggles and individuals and groups striving for social justice via identity politics. 7. To learn the history of past alliances between labour movement struggles and individuals and groups striving for social justice through identity politics in order to understand the potential of an intersectional class politics. For example, by examining the case of the 1984-1985 Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners group as documented by the film Pride. 8. To identify and develop collective campaigns on pressing political issues such as for the full and decent provision of social housing, including the safeguarding of those most vulnerable to abuse by landlords in the private rental sector, namely transgender and transsexual people. 9. To foster dialogue and debate on the nature of oppressions and exploitation and the means to resistance and social change. And finally, 10. To forge a politics that is attuned to both specificities and their connections to universal struggles for democracy, freedom, and social change.